The Wyoming high country in the spring of that year was a vast and indifferent thing. All white peaks and dark timber, a place where the snow could hold the passes shut for weeks and then let them go in a single roaring afternoon. And down at the bottom of one cold valley in the bowl of the mountains, a stagecoach came grinding through the mud toward a town called Cedar Gap. Inside it sat a woman with one trunk and one folded letter, and everything she owned in the world fit between those two things. She had crossed a continent on the strength of words a stranger had written here. She did not yet know that the man who wrote them was not the man who would meet her. She did not yet know that a good man had already died at a river crossing on this mountain, and that someone had called it an accident. Up the valley, a creditor sat with a map and a folio of papers and waited. She stepped down into the mud. A wagon came around the corner, and the man who climbed out of it turned slowly to look at her. Spring came late to Cedar Gap that year. The snow held the high passes until the middle of April, and when it finally gave way, it gave way all at once. Mud everywhere, the road down from the mountains running like a brown river. And into that mud on a Tuesday morning, the stagecoach from Cheyenne came rocking and groaning, hauling one passenger who had spent every last dollar she owned to be on it. Her name was Adeline Crane. Most people who had ever loved her called her Addie. There were not many of those people left. She was 31 years old. She knew exactly how old she was because the world had a way of reminding her. 31 and unmarried, 31 and alone, 31 and stepping down into a frontier town with one trunk, one carpet bag, and a folded letter pressed flat against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The trunk was the heavy thing, not because of what was in it, because of what it meant. She had sold the rest. The house in Ohio, what the bank had not already taken. Her mother's good dishes. The clock. The bed she had been born in and had nursed her father in for 9 long years. All of it gone, piece by piece, the way a body loses warmth on a cold night. Slowly, then all at once. And what remained of a whole life now fit inside a single trunk that a stranger was dragging off the back of a coach and dropping into the mud at her feet. She looked at it sitting there. She did not cry. She had learned somewhere in those 9 years that crying was a thing you did when you still expected the world to come and comfort you. She had stopped expecting that a long time ago. The journey here had been 4 days of it. 4 days of being shaken on hard benches beside strangers who slept against her shoulder and did not apologize. 4 days of watching the country change through a dirty window, the trees of Ohio giving way to flat grass, the flat grass giving way to a great brown emptiness that went on so long she had begun to think the land itself had given up on people. She had eaten what she could afford, which was little. She had counted her money twice a day, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts, and every day the count had been smaller. By the last morning, there had been nothing left to count. There had only been the letter and the address on it, and the hope she would not let herself name. She had thought on that last morning of all the small turns that had carried her here. If her father had not fallen ill, if her aunt had not died and left her nothing, if the bank had been kinder, which banks are not, if she had been the kind of woman a town keeps instead of the kind a town quietly stops setting a place for. So many doors had shut behind her, one after another, soft as that, and she had come to understand that a life can be narrowed the way a hallway narrows until there is only one door left ahead of you, and you do not so much choose it as get funneled through. This town was the door. Cedar Gap unrolled in front of her. A church, a mercantile with a crooked porch, a livery, a saloon, a low building with a hand-painted a sign that read Land Office, and the dark, wet shoulders of the mountains rising up behind all of it, so close and so tall that the town looked like something dropped at the bottom of a bowl. Smoke stood straight up from a dozen chimneys. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and horses and the particular clean cold of melting snow. It was beautiful. She had not expected it to be beautiful. She had expected to survive it. A woman like Addie did not come to a place like this for beauty. She came because there was nowhere else to go. Because back home, there was a word people used for a woman of 31 with no husband and no money and no parents living, and the word was spinster, and they said it kindly, which was worse than if they had said it cruel. Kindness was just pity wearing its Sunday clothes. She had heard the word in church behind a hand. She had heard it from a cousin's wife who had meant Addie believed to be gentle. She had heard it inside her own head last of all, which is where a word does its true work, and that was the day she had taken the advertisement down from the church board and folded it small and carried it home. So she had answered an advertisement. She had read it 40 times before she answered it. Wanted, a capable woman of good character to keep a mountain household and join a family in the Wyoming Territory. Marriage intended, apply by letter to H. Calder, Cedar Gap. And she had written back, and H. Calder had written to her. That was the part she could not explain to anyone, not that anyone had asked. The letters. She had expected when she answered an advertisement for a wife, the way a person answers an advertisement for a lost dog, that the man on the other end would write to her like a transaction. Terms, conditions, the price of flour. Instead, the letters had been kind, more than kind. They had been alive. Whoever H. Calder was, he wrote the way some men whittle slow and careful, taking the rough thing in his hands and turning it until it was smooth. He wrote about the mountains as though he were writing about a person he loved. He described the way the light came up the valley in the morning. He described a horse being born in the cold and standing within the hour, all legs in astonishment. He asked her what books she had read. No man had asked her that in 11 years. He asked, and then, when she answered, he wrote back about the books too, as if her answer had mattered, as if he had been waiting to hear it. She had kept those letters in the drawer of a writing desk she later sold. She had taken them out at night the way other women took out jewelry, and she had read them by a candle, and she had told herself she was only being practical, only learning the man she had agreed to marry. That was a lie, and some quiet part of her had known it was a lie. You do not read a practical document 9 times. You do not learn a sentence by heart because it is useful. And somewhere between the first letter and the 9th, Addie Crane had done a foolish thing. She had let herself hope, not loudly. Hope for her was a quiet animal that lived in a back room, and she did not feed it often. But it was there. Reading those letters by a single candle in a house with no furniture left in it, she had felt the back room door creak open, and she had thought very softly, the way you think a thing you are ashamed of. What if? What if it is not too late? What if there is still a life out there with my name on it? Now she stood in the mud of Cedar Gap with that 9th letter against her ribs, and she made herself stop. Because hope was a luxury and she had sold all her luxuries. She picked up her carpet bag. She squared her shoulders the way her father had taught her to square them. And she went to find the man she had come a long, hard way to marry. She did not have to look long. He found her. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the suck and slap of hooves in deep mud, and then it came around the corner of the mercantile and stopped. And a man climbed down from the seat, and Addie Crane forgot how to breathe. 11 years is a long time. 11 years can hollow a town, bury a parent, empty a house. 11 years had done all of that to her, and she had let of it because she had believed, as plainly as she believed the sun went down each night, that some things were simply gone. She had believed Emmett was gone. She knew his walk before she knew his face. That was the cruel mercy of it. The body remembers what the mind has tried to bury, and her body knew the particular unhurried way this man crossed a stretch of ground, knew it the way you know your own name. And her mind was still saying, it cannot be, while her heart had already fallen down a flight of stairs. He was older. Of course he was older. The boy of 22 who had once stood with her on a porch in Kansas and talked until the lamps went out, that boy was somewhere inside this man, but the man had been built over him by 11 years of weather and work. Broader, quieter in the shoulders. A dark stubble of beard, a hat worn soft, a faint scar through one eyebrow that had not been there before. But the eyes were the same, gray as a storm coming over a ridge. And those eyes found her standing in the mud beside her trunk, and they stopped. The whole man stopped. For one long, terrible, wonderful moment, neither of them moved at all. Addie, he said it the way a man says a word he has been holding under his tongue for 11 years, carefully, as if it might break. Emmett, her own voice came out of her like something climbing out of a well, and then nothing. Because what do you say? What in God's name do you say? There is no word in any language for the moment you discover that the dead are not dead, that the lost is not lost, that the man you grieved like a death has been alive this whole time, breathing the same air under different stars. Addie's mind, which was a sensible mind, a mind that had managed 9 years of a sick man's medicines and a failing household's accounts, chose that moment to come apart entirely. Emmett, here. Emmett is here. Emmett is in Wyoming. Emmett is the wagon. Emmett is the man is. Emmett, which means no. No. Stop. Think. You answered an advertisement. The advertisement said H. Calder. He is Emmett. Emmett is not an H, unless Emmett is not. The cold understanding arrived in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had not been promised to this man. She had crossed a continent on the strength of a stack of letters, and she had let herself imagine in her foolish back room the face of the man who had written them. And here was a face she had imagined for 11 years without ever meaning to. But it was the wrong face. It was the wrong face for the right reasons, and she did not understand any of it. You, she said, it was not a sentence. She could not assemble a sentence. You are H. Calder. Something crossed his face, quick, like a cloud shadow running over grass. No, Emmett said, and there it was. My brother is H. Calder, he said. Hollis, I am Emmett. He took his hat off slowly and turned it once in his hands, a small private gesture, and the sight of it nearly took her legs out from under her, because she remembered that. She remembered him doing exactly that, turning his hat in his hands, a boy on a Kansas porch, working himself up to say something true. 11 years in his hands had not forgotten either. Hollis Calder, Addie repeated. I came to marry Hollis Calder. Yes, Emmett said. The single word landed in the mud between them and lay there. A second wagon. That was what saved them, what kept the two of them from simply standing in that street until the dark came down. A second wagon coming around the mercantile, and a man on the seat of it, and Addie made herself turn and look because she could not look at Emmett one heartbeat longer without something inside her chest tearing clean through. The man on the second wagon was big. Bigger than Emmett, built like the side of a barn with a face that had been weathered into something hard and closed, and hair gone early to iron gray at the temples. He was perhaps 38. He climbed down without grace and without hurry, and he stood there looking at her the way a man looks at a horse he has bought sight unseen and is now deciding whether he has been cheated. Miss Crane, not a question. He had her like a fact. Mr. Calder, hers was a question. Hers was nothing but questions now. Hollis Calder. He did not offer his hand. You had a fair journey. He did not ask it. He stated it the way you state that a thing is finished, so that it will be finished. And Addie understood, looking at him, that this was a man who had decided long ago that words were a tool you used as little as possible the way you would use the last of the lamp oil. She looked from Hollis to Emmett and back again. Brothers, she could see it now. The same long bones, the same gray eyes, though Hollis's eyes had a kind of permanent winter in them, and Emmett's, God help her, Emmett's had something in them when they looked at her that was the very opposite of winter. Your letters, Addie said to Hollis. Hollis Calder looked at her. 12 seconds maybe of pure, flat silence. A muscle moved in his jaw. We will see to your trunk, he said, and he turned and walked toward it. Which was when Addie Crane, who had not wept on the stagecoach and had not wept selling her mother's dishes and had not wept at the side of the road, felt the whole long cost of the journey rise up the back of her throat. She swallowed it down. She had practice, but she stood very still while two strange men, one of them a stranger and one of them a ghost, lifted the last of her life into the back of a wagon and she thought with a calm that frightened her more than panic would have, "I have made a terrible mistake, and I cannot afford it." The Calder Ranch sat an hour and a half up the mountain. The wagon climbed out of Cedar Gap and into the pines, and the town fell away behind and below until it was nothing but a smudge of smoke in the bowl of the valley. The road narrowed. The trees closed in dark and dripping, enormous. Addie had grown up in flat country. She had not known land could stand up like this, could rise on every side until the sky was only a strip of pale blue directly overhead, like light coming in under a door. She rode in Hollis's wagon. That had been arranged without a word, simply by where the men stood and where they did not. Hollis drove. Emmett's wagon went ahead, and she watched the back of him the whole way up the mountain and hated herself for watching. She made herself look elsewhere, at the trees, at the mule's ears, at her own gloved hands folded in her lap. And every time within a minute, her eyes had climbed the road again to the shape of him on the wagon ahead, and she had to start the whole discipline over. A woman of 31, she told herself, ought to have more command of her own head than this. A woman of 31 who had buried her father and sold her mother's clock and crossed a continent on her own 2 feet ought not to be undone by the back of a man's coat. But she was, and there was no use pretending the climb was anything other than what it was, which was the longest hour and a half of her life. Hollis did not speak for 40 minutes. Then he said, "There is a child." Addie turned her head. "I beg your pardon." "At the house, a child, Bertie. She is 6. He kept his eyes on the mud track and the mules. "Our sister's girl, our sister and her husband are 2 years dead, the fever, and the child came to us." A pause, the wagon creaked. "I put it in a letter, the 4th one, I believe." "There was nothing about a child in any letter," Addie said. Hollis's jaw worked again, that small, grinding motion she was already coming to know. "No," he said, "I expect there was not." And he said nothing else, and Addie sat with that, turning it over. He had thought there was a child in the letters. There had not been, which meant Hollis Calder did not know the contents of the letters that bore his name, which meant somebody else did. She knew who. She had known who since the moment a man took his hat off in the street and turned it in his hands. But knowing a thing and understanding it are 2 different countries, and Addie was not yet ready to make the crossing. She tried on that climbing road to do the simple sum of it, and the simple sum would not come. A man advertises for a wife. Another man writes the letters. The woman who answers turns out to be a woman the letter writer once loved. It was the kind of coincidence that set down in a book she would not have believed. And yet she had spent 2 years in a recorder's office watching the deeds of a county pass across a counter, watching land and names and money braid themselves into knots no novelist would dare invent, and she had learned that the world is not careful to be plausible. The world does as it pleases. It is only people who need the story to make sense. "What is she like?" Addie asked. "The child." Hollis was quiet for a moment, as if the question were a tool he was not sure he knew how to hold. "Loud," he said at last. And then after the wagon had creaked on another dozen yards in a voice that had gone very slightly less flat, "She has had a hard 2 years, and she does not show it the way you would expect a child to show it. She shows it by being loud. I would take it as a kindness if you did not mistake the loud for the whole of her." It was, Addie would understand later, the longest and the kindest speech Hollis Calder made in those first weeks. And he made it about the child and not about himself, and that told her something about the man that she filed away and did not forget. The ranch, when it came suddenly. The trees simply ended, and there was a wide shelf of mountain meadow, still patched with old snow in the blue shadows, and on it, a house. Not a cabin. A real house, low and long and solid, built of squared timber, gone silver, with weather, a stone chimney. At each end, a deep porch facing down the valley. Behind it, a great barn corrals of smaller cabin sheds. And horses. Horses everywhere in the corrals and loose in the meadow, more horses than Addie had ever seen in one place, their coats steaming faintly in the cold, bright air. It was, she thought, a place a person could love. The thought arrived uninvited, and she pushed it back out the door. The front door of the house opened before the wagons had even stopped, and a small body came down off the porch like a stone from a sling. Did you bring her? Did you bring her? Asa said you would forget and bring back a sack of nails instead. The child arrived at the side of the wagon breathless, planted herself in the mud, and tipped her whole face up to look at Addie. And Addie looked down into the most ferociously curious pair of eyes she had ever encountered. Are you her? Are you the one from the letters? Bertie, said Hollis. I am only asking. You are only shouting. The child ignored this entirely and kept her eyes nailed to Addie's face. She was a sturdy little thing in a dress that had been mended at both elbows, dark hair escaping its braid in every direction, one stocking sliding down. She had a smear of something on her chin. She was, Addie thought, perfectly filthy and perfectly alive, and there was a small carved wooden horse clutched in her left hand, gripped the way other children grip a doll. I am Adeline Crane, Addie said. That is a lot of name. You may call me Addie. The child considered this offer with the gravity of a banker considering a loan. I am Bertie, she said finally. It is short for Roberta, but nobody is allowed to use Roberta, not even when I am in trouble. Uncle Emmett made me this horse. He makes them. He has made me 4. She held the little horse up for inspection, fierce and proud. Can you cook? Asa burned the beans. He burned them so bad we had to bury them. We had a funeral. And Addie Crane, far from home, exhausted past the floor of exhaustion, heartbroken, in a way she did not yet have the strength to look, had directly felt something happen at the corner of her mouth that she had not felt happen in a long while. She nearly smiled. I can cook, she said. I have never yet had to bury a meal. Bertie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once briskly, a person closing a deal, and turned and bolted back toward the house, shouting that the letter woman could cook and the beans were saved. The third brother was waiting on the porch. He was the youngest that was plain at once, perhaps 26, with an easy slouch against the post and a grin already half built on his face. Where Hollis was all winter and Emmett was all stillness, this one looked like he had never in his life met a moment he could not improve with a joke. Asa Calder, he said, coming down the steps, and unlike his brothers, he put his hand right out and Addie took it. Welcome to the Calder place, Miss Crane. I would apologize for the mud, but the mud is most of what we have got this time of year. We are rich in mud. We are mud barons. Asa, said Hollis. He says my name like that about 40 times a day, Asa told Addie cheerfully. I have learned to find it soothing, like a clock. He hauled her trunk down off the wagon as if it weighed nothing. You will be wanting to come in out of the cold. Bertie has appointed herself your I do not know what to call it, herald. She will tell you everything about everyone, whether you ask or not, and most of it will even be true. Addie went up the steps and into the house and stopped just inside the door because the inside of the house undid her a little. She had braced herself on the long road up the mountain for what a house of 3 rough bachelor men would be. She had pictured grime and disorder in a place where a woman would be hired the way you hire a mule for the labor in her. She had armored herself against it. She had not armored herself against this. The house was plain, yes. Worn, yes. But it was clean, swept the floor, scrubbed pale. A fire burned low and well-tended in the near hearth. And on every wall on shelves built into the timber were books. Dozens of them, more than dozens. Their spines worn soft with handling. And in the window light on the broad sill stood a row of small wooden horses, carved and sanded smooth, a whole herd of them, each one no bigger than a man's hand. Addie stood and looked at the books and the horses, and she felt the ground of all her careful expectations shift under her feet. She had braced for a savage. She had found a house that read, My brother Emmett carved those. Asa had come up beside her, following her eyes to the windowsill. And about half of those books are his, too. He is the family scholar. Hollis runs the ranch, I run my mouth, and Emmett mostly just thinks at things until they give up. He said it fondly. There is a stew on. Bertie was not wrong, about the beans. The funeral was small, but it was sincere. Addie was not listening quite. She had crossed the room. She was standing at the windowsill, and she had picked up one of the little horses, and she was turning it in her fingers. She knew this horse. Not this one, but its brother, its twin, its kin. She knew the particular way the mane was suggested in 3 quick strokes, knew the patient, sanded curve of the haunch, knew the small, flat place under the belly where a thumb would naturally rest. She knew it as surely as she knew Emmett's walk, as surely as she knew his hands turning a hat, because she owned one. It was upstairs right now or wherever they had carried her trunk, wrapped in a stocking at the very bottom, under everything, the one thing in 11 years, in a whole-souled house that Adeline Crane had never once been able to make herself give up. A small wooden horse, carved for her in a Kansas summer by a boy of 22, pressed into her hand the night before her father's illness called her home, the last gift of the last good season of her young life. She set the horse down on the sill very carefully as if it had become hot. So there it was, the crossing she had not been ready to make, and she had made it anyway, standing at a stranger's window with a stew on the fire. Emmett carved the horses. Emmett had always carved the horses, and the letters that bore another man's name had never, she was suddenly certain, been written by that man at all. Supper was a quiet meal, and the quiet had weight. They ate at a long table that had clearly been built by someone in the family, ate the stew that had survived where the beans had not, and Bertie carried the conversation almost single-handed because the 4 adults at that table were each for their own reasons, holding very still. Addie watched them without seeming to. She had 9 years of practice at watching a room while appearing to watch her plate. Hollis ate with a grim economy and spoke only to tell Bertie to sit on the chair and not above it. Asa filled the silences, threw out small jokes the way a man throws feed to chickens, kept things moving. And Emmett did not look at her, which was its own kind of looking. A man works that hard at not looking at a person only when looking at her costs him something. Miss Crane kept her father's accounts, Hollis said. It came out of nowhere, flat into a lull. She wrote as much, in a letter. Every head at the table turned a degree toward Addie, including Emmett's, the first time his eyes had come to her since the street. I did, Addie said, for 9 years, and before that I clerked. In the county recorder's office, 2 years copying deeds and filings. She kept her voice level and ordinary, a woman passing the salt. I have a careful hand and a better memory for a column of figures than most. My father used to say I should have been a man. He meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say. And what did you say? Emmett asked. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her since the street, and it was not about the weather, and it was not small, and the table felt it. Addie met his eyes. It cost her. She let it cost her. I said I would settle for being useful, she answered. Something moved behind Emmett's face. He looked back down at his plate, but the line of his shoulders had changed, and she saw it, and she hated that she had seen it, and she hated that she was glad. After the plates were cleared, Hollis called her, asked her to step out onto the porch. The cold met them like a wall. Full dark now, the valley below them, a black bowl with the few far lights of Cedar Gap at the bottom of it, and above more stars than Addie had ever been shown, at one time hard and bright and uncountable, the whole spilled sugar bowl of them flung across a sky that came all the way down to the black teeth of the mountains. Hollis stood at the rail with his back to all of it. He was not a man who looked at views. He was a man who looked at problems. You will have understood by now, he said, that the letters were not mine. Addie said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing a careful woman owns is her silence, and she spent it now and waited. I cannot read, Hollis said, nor write past my own name. Our father saw the ranch built and the herd raised, and he saw 3 sons fed through hard winters, but he did not see any of us to a schoolhouse because there was none, and there was always work. He said it without shame and without heat, a man reporting weather. Emmett taught himself off a Bible and a borrowed primer. Then he taught Asa. He did not get to me in time, By the time there were books in this house, I was already a grown man, doing a grown man's work, and a grown man does not sit at the foot of his younger brother to learn his letters. So, he shrugged one shoulder. I put the advertisement in, the ranch needs a woman in it. Bertie needs a woman in it more than she needs anything I know how to give her. And I cannot court a wife by post if I cannot write a word. So I asked Emmett to write for me. Addie's heart was beating very hard and very high. And he did, she said, he did. He wrote me 9 letters in your name. He wrote you. It's to you, Hollis said. More letters and longer ones than I would have thought the errand called for. And for the first time, the winter in his voice cracked just slightly, and underneath it, she heard something dry, something that in a warmer man might have grown up into humor. I did wonder. He would sit at that table half the night with the lamp burning down, writing a wife for me. I thought he was being thorough. Emmett is thorough. A pause. I am beginning to think I was a fool. Addie gripped the porch rail. The wood was cold and wet under her hands. Mr. Calder, she said, I have to ask you a plain question, and I would be grateful for a plain answer because I have spent the last of my money getting to this porch, and I cannot afford to misunderstand my situation. Did you know when you chose my letter out of however many letters came, did you know what I was to your brother? Hollis Calder was quiet for a long moment. No, he said at last. I did not know you were anything to my brother. Then slower as a man who has just heard his own words and found something wrong inside them. But Emmett did the choosing. There were 4 women wrote back to that advertisement. 4. He read me out the letters, and he put the others aside, and he set yours in front of me, and he said, this one, this is the one, the capable one. And I am not a clever man, Miss Crane, but I am not a blind one either. And I have stood here 3 minutes watching you and my brother be careful with each other, and I am doing a sum. The stars wheeled. The cold sank its teeth into Addie's hands. What does the sum come to, she whispered. It comes to a question, Hollis said. That is not mine to answer, it is his, Shez. He turned then finally and looked at her, and his hard, closed face was not unkind, only tired, only honest. I asked you here to be my wife, Miss Crane, and I am a man who keeps his word, and the offer stands. A roof, a name, a share. You would be safe here and respected, and you would never want for the plain things. I will not pretend it is more than that. I do not have more than that to give a woman. The well in me ran dry a long time ago, and I have made my peace with it. He picked his hat up off the rail. But I will not have a wife who is grieving another man across her own supper table, he said. I have seen what that does to a house, so before you and I are bound by anything, you will talk to my brother. Tonight, if you have the spine for it, and you strike me as a woman who has more spine than is good for her, you will find out what those letters were. And then you will tell me in the morning which life you are choosing. And whichever one it is, I will hold to it, and so will he, because we are the kind of men our father made. He went inside, the door shut behind him, soft final, and Addie Crane stood alone on the cold porch under all those stars and understood that the journey was not over. It had only just now on this dark mountain truly begun. She found him in the barn. She had known she would. A man like Emmett on a night like this one, with a thing this size standing unspoken between him and the world, would not be in the house. He would be where the work was, because work was the language he had instead of the other kind, and she had known that about him when she was 20 years old, and she knew it still. The barn was warm with the deep animal warmth of the horses, lantern light low and gold, the smell of hay and leather and clean dust. Emmett stood at the stall of a tall gray gelding, not working, just standing one hand flat on the animal's neck. He did not turn when the door opened, but his shoulders told her he knew it was her, and his shoulders told her he had been waiting and dreading the wait both at once. You wrote them, Addie said. No greeting. There was no room left in her for greetings. Yes, Emmett said, everyone, in your brother's name, to a woman you were procuring, for him. Her voice was shaking now, and she let it. She had held it level all through supper, and she was done holding things level. You sat at that table night after night and you wrote to me. You wrote to me about books. You asked me what I had read, and the whole time you let me believe. I did not know it was you. He turned around, and the lantern light was on his face, and Addie saw that whatever this night was costing her, it was costing him the same coin. Addie, I swear it to you on anything you want named. When Hollis asked me to write the letters, you were a name on a page, a Miss A. Crane of Ohio. There must be 100 Cranes in Ohio. I wrote the first letter to a stranger. He took a step toward her and then visibly stopped himself. Kept the distance the way you keep distance from a fire you respect. And the stranger wrote back. And she had read every book I loved and a dozen I had not got to yet. And she had a way of putting a sentence down on a page that was like hearing a voice. He stopped. His jaw worked. He had run himself straight into the thing. Say it, Addie said. By the third letter, Emmett said low, I knew. The way she wrote about her father. The way she wrote about the flat country and missing a place she did not even like, and how that was a thing a person could do. I knew. There are not two women alive who think the way you think, Addie. I had 11 years to learn how you think, and I never once managed to forget it. By the third letter, I knew the stranger was you. The barn was very quiet. One of the horses shifted its weight, a slow, soft sound. Then you should have stopped, Addie said. Then you should have written, Addie, it is, Emmett, do not come. This is not what you think it is. I should have. Why did you not? And here Emmett Calder, who measured his words the way other men measured gold dust, ran out of measuring. Because I had spent 11 years believing you were lost to me, he said. Because I wrote you 40 letters once, Addie, after Kansas, after your father took ill. I wrote, and the last 6 came back to me unopened because your family had moved on and left no road behind them, and a man can only stand at an empty mailbox so many times before he teaches himself that you are gone. I taught myself that. It took years and it near killed me, but I learned it. And then your name came across my own kitchen table. His voice broke finally clean through, and he did not try to hide it. And I knew that if I wrote the truth, if I wrote it is, Emmett, you would not come. Out of pride or hurt or a new life I did not know about you would not come. And I could not, Addie, I could not lose you to an empty mailbox twice in one lifetime. So I was a coward, and I let the letters bring you here. And I told myself that once you were standing in front of me, I would find the courage I could not find with a pen. And then I was standing in front of you, Addie said, in the street, and you said nothing. And then you were standing in front of me in the street, Emmett said, promise to my brother, and everything I had planned to say turned to ash in my mouth because I understood all at once what I had done. I had not brought you home. I had brought you to Hollis. The lantern flame leaned and steadied. Addie found that she had sat down. There was a milking stool, and she had found it without meaning to, and she sat on it with her hands in her lap, and she felt 11 years, and the whole long road settled onto her shoulders all at the same time. I grieved you, she said quietly. Do you understand that? I did not lose you the way you lose a glove. I grieved you, Emmett, the way I grieved my mother. I put you in the ground in my own heart, and I stood at the grave and I said the words, and I walked away, because that was the only way I could go on. And I did go on. I went on for 11 years. And now you are telling me the grave was empty the whole time. Yes, Emmett said. The word was barely sound. I am telling you that. That is a cruel thing to be told. I know it. It is also, Addie said, and now her voice did break finally after all the miles, the only thing I have wanted to hear since I was 20 years old. And there it was set out in the warm gold air of the barn, impossible to take back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The whole ruined, wonderful truth of it stood between them, and they both just looked at it. Then Emmett crossed the barn. He did not touch her. He knelt down in the straw in front of the milking stool so that his eyes were level with hers, the way a man kneels to a child or a horse or a thing he is afraid of frightening. And he reached into his coat, slow, and he brought something out, and he held it in his open palm between them in the lantern light. A small wooden horse, not new, old. The carving of a much younger, much less practiced hand. The mane suggested in three quick strokes, a flat place worn smooth under the belly where for 11 years a thumb had rested. You kept yours, Emmett said. It was not a question. He had seen her face at the windowsill. He had been watching her after all. I never finished a single thing the summer I knew you, Addie, except this. And I have carried it every day for 11 years into Wyoming up this mountain, and I could not have told you why. A grown man carrying a child's toy in his coat. He closed his hand around it gently. Except I think I always knew why. I think I was keeping it for the day I could put it back in your hand. Addie looked at the closed fist, at the old horse in Sweden, at the man kneeling in the straw, who was not a ghost, who had never been a ghost, who had been Olivier Stivocky and reachable and writing letters into the dark this whole long time. And she did not take the horse. Not because she did not want it, because she wanted it so much that her hands were not safe, and because somewhere down the mountain a child was asleep who needed a mother, and a hard, tired, honest man was waiting on a promise and a contract with the name H. Calder on it, was sitting in her trunk like a loaded thing. Hollis says I must choose by morning, she said, between the two of you, between the life he is offering and the truth you are. I know what Hollis said. It is not a fair thing to ask of one night. No, Emmett agreed, it is not. He stood up out of the straw. He put the old horse back inside his coat over his heart, where it had ridden for 11 years. So I will not ask it of you tonight. I have already done you enough wrong with my hurry and my cowardice. I will not crowd a decision this size. He looked at her, and the gray eyes in the lantern light were steady now and clear, and they held hers without flinching, the way they had once watched her cry on a porch and not looked away. But hear me say one true thing before you go up to that house, Addie Crane, so that whatever you choose it knowing. I did not bring you here for Hollis. I told myself I did. I am done telling myself things. I brought you here because I could not breathe in a world that did not have you somewhere in it, and I would do it again, and I am not sorry. And that is the whole of it. The wind moved against the barn wall. Far off, high up the mountain, something called once into the dark and went still. Good night, Addie, Emmett said. And Addie Crane walked back up to the house alone, under all those stars with a choice the size of the whole sky waiting for the morning. And she did not yet know, climbing those cold steps, that there was a far older and far darker thing buried on this mountain than her own buried heart. She did not know about the river crossing. She did not know that the previous autumn, a good man named Amos Calder had ridden into the ford below the ranch the way he had ridden it for 40 years and had not ridden out. She did not know that down in Cedar Gap, a man named Horace Thorne sat that very night with a leather folio of papers on his desk and a map of this valley and a particular interest in the water that ran through the Calderland and the patience of a man who has already gotten away with one thing and is calculating the cost of a second. She did not know any of that yet, but she would, because the trunk she had carried across a continent held more than a wooden horse and a sold woman's last few dresses, and the choice waiting for her in the morning was not the only choice this mountain was going to ask of her. Addie reached the top of the steps. She put her hand on the door, and behind her down in the black bowl of the valley, the few small lights of Cedar Gap burned on in the dark, patient as a held breath, waiting for what the spring would bring. Morning came to the mountain the way mercy sometimes comes, not in a blaze, in a slow gray lightning that a tired person could almost miss. Addie had not slept. She had lain in the narrow room they had given her under a quilt that smelled of cedar, and she had listened to the house settle and tick and breathe around her, and she had turned the choice over and over in her hands until it was smooth and gave her no answer at all. Hollis, a roof, a name, a man who would never ask her for the one thing she did not know how to give a stranger. There would be a kind of peace in that she had thought somewhere past midnight, the peace of a transaction honestly kept. She had spent 9 years giving and giving to a man who could not give back. And there was a tired part of her that found the idea of a marriage with no debt of feeling in it almost restful the way a person far past hunger stops wanting the meal. Emmett, the truth, the grave that had been empty all along. And that was not restful at all. That was the opposite of restful. That was a door thrown open in a house she had spent 11 years carefully sealing for the winter. She rose before the sun because that was what she did. Because a woman who has spent 9 years rising before a sick man's first need does not know how to lie in a bed and wait for her life to be decided. She dressed, she went down the dark stairs by feel, and she found to her surprise that the kitchen was not empty. Bertie sat at the long table in her nightgown with a quilt around her shoulders, and the small carved horse standing on the wood in front of her like a sentinel. The child was not crying. She was simply awake the way old people are awake before dawn, looking at nothing. "You are up early," Addie said. "So are you." "I am always up early." "So am I." Bertie pulled the quilt tighter. "I wake up and I think Mama's going to be the one who comes down. And then I remember she is not. And then I am awake for good." She said it plainly, a fact she had carried so long it had stopped having sharp edges. "Asa says it gets better. Asa says a lot of things." Addie stood very still in the cold kitchen. Because she knew that hour. She knew it from the other side of it. She knew the precise weight of waking into a house that had a hole in it shaped like a person. She had woken into it every morning for a year after her father died, reaching before she was awake enough to know better for the sound of his breathing in the next room. She did not say it gets better. She did not say anything at all. She crossed the kitchen and she knelt down by the child's chair and she began quietly to build up the fire. And after a moment, Bertie slid down off the chair and crouched beside her and handed her kindling one piece at a time, and the two of them brought the morning up out of the cold ashes together without another word. That was how Emmett found them when he came down. He stopped in the doorway. He did not speak. But Addie felt him there, felt him take in the picture of it, the woman and the child, and the new fire, and she heard him breathe out slow, like a man setting down something heavy. And she understood, in kneeling on that hearth, that her choice had been made. Maybe in the night, maybe 11 years ago on a Kansas porch. It did not matter when. It was made. She found Hollis in the barn after breakfast. He was forking hay and he did not stop when she came in, and she was grateful for that because it is easier to say a hard, true thing to a man who is not looking at you. "I have your answer," she said. Hollis forked another load. "I expect I have it too. I have had it since the porch." He set the fork down. He looked at her, that hard, closed face, and Addie braced for the winter in it. But the winter was not there. "I want to say a thing to you, Miss Crane, and then we will neither of us speak of it again." He pulled his hat off the way all the Calder men did, and she saw it cost him something. "I asked you here for the ranch. I will not pretend otherwise. But I have watched my brother for 11 years, and Emmett has been a man with a lamp on in a room with no one in it, carving horses for a child that was not even born yet, reading the same 6 books till the spines gave out. I did not have a name for what was wrong with him. I do now. The name was you." Addie's throat closed. "He came alive in this house yesterday," Hollis said. "I have not seen that man alive since before our father. So," he put the hat back on, "you are not breaking a promise to me. You are mending one I did not know I was making. Marry my brother Addie. Be a Calder by the better door. The paper in your trunk with my name on it is kindling now, and you may burn it whenever it suits you. And let me go back to my hay, because I have said more words this morning than I generally say in a month, and it has wearied me considerably." And Addie Crane laughed, wet-eyed in a coal barn far from the wreck of her old life. She laughed. So the spring turned and Addie stayed, not as a wife, not yet. There was a propriety to be kept, and a wedding could not be a thing done in a morning. And besides, Addie found she did not want it done in a morning. She had been handed back a life she had buried. She wanted to walk into it slowly with her eyes open the way you walk into deep water. She moved through the long, bright days of the mountain spring, and she learned the shape of the Calder place. She learned that Hollis rose before any of them and worked past all of them and spoke to the horses more gently than he spoke to men. She learned that Asa could not pass a serious moment without setting a small joke beside it, the way you set a lamp beside a sick bed, and that this was not foolishness in him, but a kind of courage. She learned that the books on the walls were a map of Emmett's whole hidden self, and that he had read every one of them in a house where reading had to be defended like a small fire in a wind. And she learned the work, the real work, the daily weight of a mountain ranch in spring, and she learned it the way she had learned everything in her life, by doing it badly, and then less badly, and then well. She learned that bread does not rise the same at this altitude, and she ruined 2 loaves and was furious about it, and Asa ate the second ruined loaf anyway, the whole leaden brick of it, and pronounced it the finest doorstop in the territory. She learned to carry water and to pull a calf, and to tell which of the laying hens was lying. She had not done physical work like this in years, not since the nursing years went still and small and indoors, and her hands cracked and her back ached, and she found to her own deep surprise that she did not mind. There was a plain honesty to a day that ended in tiredness you had earned. It was different from the tiredness of grief, which earned you nothing. Bertie shadowed her through all of it. The child had decided something about Addie on that first muddy afternoon, some private verdict, and having decided it, she did not revisit it. She simply attached herself the way a small, determined burr attaches itself, and she narrated. She narrated the ranch, the horses, the brothers, the weather, the long, sad 2 years before Addie came. She told Addie which step of the porch creaked and why Asa was not allowed to cook, and how her own mother used to braid hair with a ribbon worked into it. And she told this last thing carefully, watching Addie's face, the way a child sets a fragile object down in front of a stranger to see if the stranger will be gentle with it. Addie was gentle with him. She had a good deal of practice being gentle with fragile things. And she learned the boundaries of her own usefulness, and then she pushed them. She had come to keep a household. She did keep it, but Addie Crane had clerked 2 years in a county recorder's office, and she had run a dying man's affairs for 9, and she had a careful hand and a better head for figures than any man on that mountain. And it did not take her long to see that the Calder Ranch, for all its fine horses and good timber, was being run out of a strong box and a poor memory. "Where are your accounts?" she asked Hollis one evening. Hollis looked at her as if she had asked where they kept the ocean. "In my head," he said. "Show me your head then." So he showed her. He sat at the long table and he told her from memory what the ranch took in and what it paid out, and Addie wrote it down in a clean column in a ledger she had bought herself in Cedar Gap. And at the bottom of the column she drew a line and she did the sum. And the sum was wrong. Not by a little, by a great deal. There was money owed that Hollis spoke of as a small thing, a debt against the land carried over from their father's time, and the figure Hollis carried in his head. For it was one figure, and the figure that the arithmetic demanded was another much larger, and the gap between the two of them sat on the page like a cold draft from a door left open somewhere in the house. "Who holds this debt?" Addie said. "Thorne," said Hollis. "Horace Thorne. He has the big spread down the valley. He bought the paper up after our father." He shrugged the one shoulder. "He has been decent about it. Patient." Addie looked at the gap on the page, at the patient creditor, at the word decent, and something in the back of her clerk's mind, the part of her that had spent 2 years watching how men move land and money across a recorder's counter, stood up very quietly and began to pay attention. "I would like to see the paper," she said. "The actual paper, not the figure in your head." "It is at the land office, filed." "Then I will go to the land office." She did not go that week. There was no cause she could name out loud, and a woman did not ride into town to read a man's filings without a reason that would survive being spoken. But she set it aside in herself the way she set aside a stitch to be picked out later, and she did not forget it. Addie Crane was not built to forget an open draft in a cold house. What she did that spring was fall the rest of the way in love. It happened the way the snow had left the passes, slowly and then all at once. It happened in the small things because the small things were all Emmett had ever trusted himself with. He did not court her with words. He had used up a lifetime's words in 9 letters, and he had none left over, and she did not want them anyway. He courted her the way a careful man builds a fire, one patient piece at a time. He left a book on the windowsill where she would find it. The next morning there was another beside it, and a third the morning after, until there was a small, leaning stack. And not one word was ever said about the stack, and the stack was a whole conversation. He taught her the horses. He put her up on a steady old mare, and he walked beside the animal's head, through the meadow, his hand near the bridle and never on it, and he taught her to read the country the way he read it, weather in the way the aspens turn their leaves, a coming change in the set of a horse's ears. And Addie, who had grown up in flat tame land, found that her chest did a strange and unfamiliar thing up on that weedy bright shelf of mountain, and it took her a shameful while to put a name to the thing, and the name was joy. She had forgotten she was allowed it. That was the cruelest arithmetic of those 9 nursing years, and Addie understood it now, looking down a green valley from the back of a gentle mare. Grief does not only take the person, grief takes the whole country around the person. It had taken her father, and then it had quietly gone on to take her own right to a morning like this one, and she had let it because letting it had felt like loyalty. It was not loyalty. It was just another room with the lamp off. And Emmett called her, walking beside her horse, and saying almost nothing, was going through that house of hers, room by room, and turning the lamps back on. There was an afternoon well into May when he took her up to a high meadow. She had not seen before, a green shelf above the tree line, with the whole valley laid out below it like something a generous hand had spread on a table. They sat on a fallen log and ate bread and cold meat, and did not for a long while say anything at all. And the not saying anything was easy, and that was the thing that undid her. Addie had spent 11 years among people with whom silence was a held breath. With Emmett, the silence was a place you could put your weight down. "You wrote me once," she said at last, about Kansas, in one of the letters. "You did not write it as yourself, of course. You wrote it as Hollis. But you wrote about a summer when you were young and a girl you used to talk to on a porch." "I did," Emmett said. "You took a risk writing that." "I did," he said again. "I told myself I would not, and then the lamp would burn down and the house would go quiet and I would have a pen in my hand and I would find that I had written you straight back into the world before I had decided to." He turned a piece of bread over in his fingers and did not eat it. "I think part of me was leaving a trail, the way a man lost in timber will break branches. I think part of me wanted you to read it and know, even if your mind did not let you know it yet." "I did know it," Addie said. "I read that letter and something in my chest stood up. I told myself it was only that the writing was fine. I have spent a great deal of my life telling myself it was only something else." "So have I," Emmett said. "We are a matched pair that way. Two people who became very skilled at the wrong thing." And Addie laughed the surprised laugh of a woman who has not had much occasion for it, and the sound of it rolled out over the valley and came back, and she thought this. I had forgotten there was a this. There came an evening, the 4th week or near it. Bertie had been put to bed under loud protest. Hollis had gone out to the barn. Asa had taken himself off to the smaller cabin with a great show of being subtle, which was the least subtle thing a man could possibly do, and Addie and Emmett were left alone in the main room with the fire and the books and the row of small horses on the sill. Emmett was carving. He sat near the fire with a half-made horse in his hands and a curl of pale wood building up on the floor by his boot. And Addie sat across from him with the ranch ledger open in her lap, not reading it, watching his hands. "You always do that," she said. "When you are working a thing out, you carve." My father carved. The knife moved small and sure. First thing I remember of him, his hands and a piece of pine. He said a man should always have something in his hands that he is making better. Said it kept the other thing quiet. What other thing? Emmett did not answer for a moment. The knife stopped. The thing that tells you the day was wasted, he said. The thing that counts up everything you did not get to. He had a loud one of those. I think I have it too. He looked up at her, then across the firelight. It has been quiet since you came. I notice these things. I have spent a great deal of my life noticing when a room got quieter. Addie's heart turned over. Emmett, I am not going to say a great deal, he said. I have learned that I am not to be trusted with a great deal, but I am going to say one thing and then I am going to go back to this horse, and you may do with it what you like. He set the knife down. He set the wood down. He put his rough hands flat on his knees and he looked at her the way he had looked at her on a Kansas porch a whole lifetime ago, steady, unflinching, a man who had decided not to be a coward twice. I have loved you since I was 22 years old, Emmett Calder said. I loved you across 11 years in an empty mailbox in a whole continent, which I would have told you was not possible, except that I did it. And I am not asking you for anything tonight. I asked you for too much, too fast the day you got off that coach, and I will not do it again. I am only telling you the way you tell a person the weather so they can dress for the day. The weather is that I love you. That is all. That is the whole forecast. And Addie Crane, who had not let herself cry on the stagecoach, or selling her mother's dishes, or at the side of the road, set the ledger aside and crossed a small room and knelt down in the wood shavings in front of his chair. She took his face in both her hands. You stubborn, she said, patient, foolish carving man. Yes, Emmett agreed. I dressed for that weather 11 years ago, Addie said. I never once changed my clothes. She kissed him then. By the fire in the shavings with the small wooden horses watching from the sill. It was not a young kiss. It was better than a young kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had each privately buried this exact moment and were now astonished past speaking to find it alive. When it ended, they stayed close, her hands still on his face, his forehead come down to rest against hers. I will marry you, Addie said against his mouth, in the summer, properly, with Bertie throwing flowers and Asa making an unbearable speech. Asa will weep, Emmett said. He weeps at everything. He wept at the Bean funeral. And Addie laughed, and the laugh went into the kiss, and the fire burned down low and gold. And for one whole night on that mountain, there was nothing in the world that was wrong. It did not last. Of course it did not last. The good nights never know how few of them there are. It was Bertie who found the first thread of it. Children always find the threads. They are closer to the ground. It was a warm afternoon, and Addie had taken the child down toward the river to look for the early flowers, the way they did most fine days now. And Bertie had run ahead the way she ran everywhere, and then Bertie had stopped. She had stopped at the top of the bank, above the crossing, the wide gravel ford where the road went over the river, and she had gone very still. And when Addie came up beside her, the child had reached out and taken a fistful of Addie's skirt and held it. I do not like this place, Bertie said. It is only the river, sweetheart. This is where Grandfather Amos died. The child's voice had gone small and flat. He fell off his horse in the water, and the water was calm and high, and he did not get up. They told me it was an accident. They told me it 40 times. She looked up at Addie, and there was something in the small face that was far too old for 6 years. But Grandfather Amos let me ride in front of him 100 times right across this water, and he was not ever even a little bit afraid of it. And Uncle Emmett will not come down here. Not ever. He sends Asa to mend the fence here. He has not put his boots on this gravel since the autumn. Addie stood at the top of the bank and looked down at the bright, ordinary water. A man who had ridden a crossing for 40 years and was thrown by it. A son who could not put his boots on the gravel where his father died. A debt whose figure did not match its arithmetic. A creditor who was patient and decent. The clerk in the back of Addie's mind, the one who had stood up quietly weeks ago, took one slow step forward. Bertie, she said, and she kept her voice as light as the spring air, because you do not let a child carry the weight of your own dawning cold. Run and see if the flowers came up by the big rock. I will be along. And when the child had gone, Addie Crane stood alone above the river crossing for a long time, and she did not look at the flowers, and she did not look at the water. She looked at the gravel. She went to town 3 days later. She had her reason now, a small, honest one, she could say aloud. The mercantile thread and salt. And while she was down in the bowl of the valley with the wagon and a free hour, she walked across the muddy street to the low building with a hand-painted sign, and she went into the Cedar Gap land office, and she asked the clerk very pleasantly, a woman simply being thorough on behalf of the family she was marrying into, if she might see the filings on the Calder property. The clerk was a thin, nervous man named Pruitt, and Addie noticed, because noticing was her trade, that the name Calder made his hands go still on the counter for just a moment before he fetched the box. She spread the papers on the counter, and the recorder's daughter, the woman who had copied 2 years of deeds and filings in another life, bent her careful head over them and began quietly to read. The deed to the Calder land. Old, sound, Amos Calder's name in a strong square hand. The water rights. This was the heart of it on the frontier. The water was always the heart of it, the right to the river that ran down through the Calder meadow and on eventually to everyone below. She read the water filing twice. It was in order. Amos had held the senior right to that river, the first and oldest claim, and senior right was a kind of crown. And then the debt. The paper Hollis carried as a small thing in his head. Addie laid it flat and read it down to the bottom. And the cold draft she had felt for weeks became a wind. Because the figure was wrong. Yes, the figure was monstrous, far past anything Hollis believed he owed. But that was not what stopped Addie Crane's breath in the close, dusty air of the land office. What stopped her breath was the seal. A territorial recorder's seal pressed into the bottom of the debt paper to make it law. Addie had spent 2 years of her young life looking at exactly such seals, hundreds of them, until the shape of a true one lived in her hands the way Emmett's carving lived in his. And this seal was not a true one. The eagle's wing was wrong. A genuine territorial seal carried 7 feathers in the spread of the wing. She had pressed enough of them to know it as surely as she knew her own name, and this seal carried 6. 6 feathers, a tiny thing. A thing no rancher would ever catch, no cowhand, no grieving son carrying a figure in his head. A thing only a clerk would catch. A thing only a woman who had been told her whole life she should have been a man and had instead been made into something the men around her never thought to suspect, an invisible, careful reader of other men's papers. The debt against the Calder ranch was a forgery. Addie stood at the counter with the false seal under her fingertip, and she felt the whole shape of it begin to rise up out of the dark like land coming up out of fog. A senior water right, the most valuable thing in the valley, an old man who had held it for 40 years and would never sell it. An old man thrown by a river he had crossed 10,000 times. A forged debt large enough to swallow a ranch whole, waiting quiet and patient as a snare held by a man down the valley who wanted that water. A man who was decent, a man who was patient. A man, Addie thought, with her heart going like a hammer, who only had to wait for a grieving family to fail to make a payment they did not even know the true size of. Miss Pruitt, the clerk, was watching her. His hands were not still now. They were too still, the way a rabbit is too still. Miss was there. Did you find what you needed? Addie Crane looked up from the false seal, and she did the hardest thing she had done since she stepped off the coach, harder than the barn, harder than the porch. She made her face into nothing. She made it into the face of a pleasant, thorough bride, checking on her new family's small affairs. She gathered the papers and squared their edges and pushed the box back across the counter with a smile that cost her everything she had. "Thank you," she said. "It is all just as Maya, as the Calder said. I only wanted to understand it. A woman likes to understand a thing before she puts her name beside it." "Of course," said Pruitt. "Of course she does." But his eyes followed her all the way to the door, and Addie felt them, and she knew with the same certainty that had read 6 feathers where there should have been 7, that before her wagon had even cleared the edge of town, the thin, nervous clerk would be sending word down the valley to the decent and patient man who paid him. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. She took the reins in hands that wanted very badly to shake and would not be allowed to. She did not yet have proof. A wrong feather was a suspicion, not a verdict. The true paper, the real debt, the thing the forgery had been built to hide that was somewhere still, and an old man who would forge a seal would not leave the truth where a careful woman could simply walk in and read it. But Amos Calder had ridden that crossing for 40 years, and Amos Calder had not been a careless man. And Addie Crane, turning the wagon up toward the mountain and the long climb home, understood that somewhere in the silver timber house above her, in a wall under a stone behind the worn spine of a book, an honest dead man had almost certainly left behind the one thing that could undo all of this. Because honest men, when they begin to be afraid, do not run. They write it down. She would have to find it before Horace Thorne understood that she had learned to count feathers. The thought of his name put a cold hand flat against her back the whole way up the mountain, and she did not once turn around to look at the road behind her because she was afraid of what Patience looked like coming on. She told Emmett that night, only Emmett, by the barn in the dark with the lantern turned low. She told it plainly, the gap in the figures in the box at the land office in the 6 feathers where the law required 7. And she watched Emmett Calder's face change as she spoke, watched the quiet of him go from the soft quiet of a contented man to a different quiet entirely, an old hard quiet, a quiet with a floor under it that she had not known was there. "You are certain," he said, "about the seal." "I am as certain as 2 years of my life can make me." Emmett turned away from her. He put both hands on the top rail of the corral, and he stood looking out at the dark shapes of the horse, and he was silent for a long time, and the silence was not empty. It was a man holding something with both hands so it would not get loose. "My father," he said at last, "started sleeping badly in the last month of his life. I had forgotten that. I made myself forget it." His voice was very low. "He took to riding out alone. He took to checking the fence line himself, the river line, which was Ace's job and had been for years. And one night I came out here this same yard, and he was standing right about where you are standing, and I asked him what was wrong, and he said—" Emmett stopped. His knuckles were white on the rail. He said, "A man can lose a thing slow, Emmett, so slow, he helps to carry it out the door himself." And I thought he was talking about getting old. I told him to go to bed. I told my father to go to bed, Addie, and 3 weeks later they pulled him out of that crossing. The night was vast and cold around the two of them. "He knew," Emmett said. "He knew Thorne was coming for the water. He was trying to tell me, and I was not listening because I did not want my father to be a man with troubles. I wanted him to be my father." He turned around, and his eyes in the lantern light were wet and terrible and absolutely steady. He would have written it down. "You are right, he kept everything, 40 years of everything. If he was afraid, there is a paper, and it is in that house, and we are going to find it." "We are," Addie said. "But Emmett, the clerk saw my face. Thorne will know someone has started counting. We do not have the whole summer. We may not have a month." And as if the mountain itself had been waiting for her to say it, the wind changed. It came down off the high peaks all at once, a cold breath out of a clear sky, and it moved through the aspens with a long hiss, and it turned every pale leaf over to show its silver underside, and the temperature dropped so fast that Addie felt it touch her teeth. Emmett lifted his head. He read the air the way he had taught her to read it, and whatever he read there made the last of the soft go out of him. "That is wrong," he said quietly. "That wind is a month early." Up the mountain, far above the warm-lit windows of the house, the first thin gray banners of cloud had begun to pull themselves across the face of the peaks. And somewhere in the timber, low and long, a sound rolled down toward them that was not the wind, that was the wind's harder, colder brother coming behind it. Addie stood in the yard beside the man she had crossed a continent in 11 years to find, and she watched the storm gather itself in the high dark. And she understood that the mountain was not going to give them the month. The mountain was not going to give them the week. Whatever the Calders were going to have to face, the snow was coming down to meet them first. And it was coming early, and it was coming fast, and a 6-year-old child was asleep in that house who liked more than almost anything in the world to slip out at first light and bring her own small pony in from the meadow by herself. They spent that evening making the house ready the way a mountain family learns to make ready, and Addie worked alongside them and watched how 3 men who had lost what they had lost moved through a coming storm. Hollis went silent and certain. Asa went quiet, which was its own kind of warning. The lamp set down beside the sick bed, and the joking hand gone still. Emmett kept finding small reasons to pass the foot of the stairs where above the child slept. "She knows the meadow," Asa said once low, not quite to anyone. "She has brought that pony in 100 mornings." "She has brought it in on 100 fine mornings," Emmett said. And that was all. And no one answered him, and the wind found a gap in the eaves and made a sound like a held note. The storm came in the night the way the worst things do when a house is asleep and trusting. Addie woke to a world gone white and roaring. The window of her narrow room was a square of nothing. No valley, no barn, no mountain. Only the snow driven sideways so thick and so fast that the dawn could not get through it. And the wind around the eaves had a voice now low and steady and enormous. The voice of something that did not know the house was there and would not have cared. She dressed before she was fully awake, because 9 years of a sick man's house had built that into her bones. You wake, you dress, you go and see what the night has done. And what the night had done was take Bertie. She knew it the moment she came down the stairs. She knew it from the cold. The kitchen door stood open a hand's width, and the snow had come in across the scrub floor in a long white tongue, and on the table the small carved horse stood alone where the child always left it. Bertie never left the horse. Bertie carried that horse the way other children carried their own name. Bertie had gone out without it, which meant Bertie had gone out fast and early and certain the way she went out every fine morning of her life to bring her pony in from the meadow before anyone could tell her not to. Except this was not a fine morning. "Emmett!" Addie did not scream it. She had no breath to scream it. She set it into the house like a stone dropped down a well, and the house woke. "Emmett, the door! Bertie!" The door was open and the horse is on the table, and then she has gone for the pony. What happened next happened fast, and it happened without wasted words, because the Calder men had been raised by a mountain, and the mountain did not give second chances. Hollis was already pulling on his coat. How long has that door been open?" "I do not know. The snow is halfway to the table leg." "Too long," Hollis said, and the word too came out of him like something torn. "That meadow in this, a grown man could lose the barn in this." Asa had the lantern lit, was thrusting coats and rope and a coil of it over his own shoulder. The jokes were gone from his face. Addie had not believed until that moment that Asa Calder had a face under the jokes. And there it was, and it was white, and it was terrified, and it was already moving. And Emmett stood for 1/2 of 1 second in the middle of the cold kitchen, and Addie watched him look at the open door, the white roaring nothing beyond it, and she watched the oldest fear of his life rise up and look back at him. Because the meadow ran down to the river. The river ran down to the crossing. And the crossing was the place where this family lost the people it loved. "I am going with you," Addie said. "No." "Emmett." "Addie, no, you do not know the ground you will be a second life I have to find. I know how a frightened child thinks." She was already in his coat. She was already winding a wool scarf across her face, and her voice came out muffled and shaking and absolutely immovable. "Bertie is not lost in that meadow, Emmett. Bertie does not believe she is lost. Bertie believes she is being brave and that she will be in trouble. A child who thinks she is in trouble does not stand still and wait to be found. She hides. She will have got to something, a fence, a rock, the old line cabin, and she will be tucked down behind it, being brave and being quiet, and you will walk straight past her in this and never know. You need someone who is thinking like her. That is me. That has always been me." The wind screamed against the house, and Emmett Calder, who had spent 11 years and 40 letters learning that he could not keep the people he loved by holding them still, looked at her one heartbeat longer. Then he took the rope from Asa's shoulder and tied one end around his own waist and the other around hers. Hard a knot that meant he had decided. You stay on this rope, he said. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, the rope is the only true thing out there. You hold the rope and you hold me. I am holding you, Addie said. I have got you. Go. They went out into the white. There are no words honest enough for what that meadow was. Addie had thought she understood cold. She had nursed winters in Ohio. She had not understood anything. This cold was a living hand laid flat against the whole front of her body, and the snow was not falling. The snow was being thrown, and within 10 steps, the house behind her was gone, simply gone, swallowed. And there was no up and no down and no direction in all the world, except the pull of the rope at her waist and the dark shape of Emmett bent into the wind ahead of her. They could not call. The wind ate sound. They had agreed on it at the door. They would not waste their strength shouting into a thing that swallowed shouting. They would search the way you search a dark room, by the hands, by the ground, by knowing the child. So Addie did the only thing she could do. She walked and she held the rope, and she thought like a 6-year-old who believed she was in trouble. Not the open meadow. Bertie would not stop in the open. The pony first, always the pony, so she would have gone down toward the meadow's bottom, where the animal sheltered, down toward the willows, down toward the line of the river, down toward the crossing. Addie tugged the rope, twice, their signal for this way, and she felt Emmett resist it for one terrible second, felt the rope go rigid because he knew what was down there too. He knew it in the deepest cellar of himself. And then she felt him choose. She felt the rope go with her. That was the bravest thing she ever felt a man do, and he did it blind in a blizzard where no one would ever see it but her. Emmett Calder turned and walked toward the river that had killed his father, because the woman on the other end of his rope had asked him to. They went down through a world with no edges. Twice Addie went to her knees in a drift, and twice the rope took her weight and held, and twice she got herself up and did not let go, and her hands inside her gloves had stopped being hands and become only a grip, only a thing that held. She had thought before this that she knew what it was to keep going past the end of yourself. She had thought the 9 years had taught her that. But the 9 years had been a slow teaching, and this was a fast one, and the fast one cut deeper. Be 6, she told herself over and over, into the scarf, into the roar. Be 6 and proud, and then be 6 and frightened. Where do you go? They found the line cabin first, a low dark shape that loomed up out of the white with no warning at all, the old herder's shelter on the slope above the ford, and Addie's heart leapt because it was exactly the kind of thing a brave, frightened child would run for. They got the door open against the wind. They fell inside into the sudden, shocking quiet of walls. Empty, cold ash in the hearth, no child. And Addie stood in that empty cabin with the breath sawing in and out of her and felt the first true claw of despair, because if Bertie was not here, then Bertie was lower, and lower was the water. And how long had that kitchen door stood open? Stop. Stop it. You are no use to her drowning in your own fear. Think. Be 6. Be 6 years old and proud and certain, and then suddenly somewhere out here, be 6 years old and not certain anymore. Where do you go when being brave runs out and you are only small? Where? You go to the thing you know. You go to the thing that is yours, the pony. Addie seized Emmett's arm and put her muffled mouth right against the wool over his ear. The pony has a shelter, the little 3-sided shed by the willows. Bertie helped build it. You told me she thinks of it as hers. If she got to the pony, she would not leave the pony. She would get them both into the shed, and she would wait. Emmett, the shed. She felt him understand. She felt the whole of him turn toward it. They went back out into the white, and they went down, and the slope steepened under their feet, and Addie could hear it now. Under the wind, the river, the low, cold, grinding voice of the high water closer than she wanted it, and she held the rope, and she held her terror in both hands, and she walked. The cold had stopped feeling like cold. That frightened her more than anything had frightened her yet, because she knew from the nursing years, from the long study of a failing body, that cold which has stopped feeling like cold is cold, that has begun to win. She kept her legs moving by an act of will that was nearly arithmetic. One, and then one, and then one, and then the snow opened. Just for a moment. The wind drew one long breath the way a storm sometimes will, a gap of 2 seconds, three. And in that gap, Addie saw the dark, low line of the three-sided shed. And she saw the small shape tucked into the corner of it behind the warm bulk of a shaggy pony, knees up, arms around the animal's foreleg, a child being brave, a child being quiet, a child waiting exactly the way Addie had sworn on the kitchen floor that she would be waiting. After that, there was no cold. There was no storm. There was only the last 40 feet and crossing them and getting her arms around that small, frozen, rigid body and Bertie's face coming up out of the pony's shaggy side blue lip, tear stiff, and Bertie's voice when it came so small and so high and so completely undone. I could not find the way back, the child sobbed. I tried to be brave, and then the brave ran out. I know, Addie said into her hair. I know it does. I know exactly. But listen to me, Bertie called her. You listen. You did the one right thing. You stayed with what was yours, and you waited, and you let us come to you. And that is not the brave running out. That is the smartest brave there is. They got her up. They got her wrapped inside Emmett's own coat against his own chest. In the pony they turned loose into its shed, and they went back up the rope, hand over hand, into the teeth of it, the four of them now. Emmett and Addie and the child and the small wooden horse Addie had snatched off the kitchen table and carried in her pocket the whole way because she had known that a child who woke afraid would need the thing that was hers. They did not make the house. The wind had built past the house. They made the line cabin and they fell through its door, and Hollis and Asa found them there an hour later by following Asa's rope, and the six of them, 2 ponies worth of relief, crowded into that one small room while the storm spent its rage on the roof. Addie built the fire, of course she did, and as the warmth came up and the child slept at last against Emmett's chest, Addie sat back on her heels in the firelight and looked at the cabin around her properly for the first time. It was Amos Calder's cabin. She understood that all at once. The herder's shelter, yes, but the old man had used it, made it his own. In his last troubled months, the months he had taken to riding out alone, there was a single shelf, a tin of long, stale tobacco, a folded blanket, and a hearthstone broad and flat, the great stone slab at the foot of the fire. A man can lose a thing slow, Emmett. So slow, he helps to carry it out the door himself. Addie looked at the hearthstone. She thought of a frightened, honest man who would not run, who would write it down, who would put it somewhere only family would think to look somewhere a forging patient creditor would never imagine, because a forging patient creditor does not sit by this poor little fire and know that it was the last warm place an old man trusted. She did not say a word. She simply leaned forward in the firelight with 3 Calder men watching her, and she worked her cold fingers into the seam at the edge of the hearthstone, and she lifted. It was heavy. It came up grudging an inch, and then more, and underneath it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp dry, and waiting and patient as the grave was a flat bundle of papers. Emmett made a sound, low, as if something had struck him. Addie drew the bundle out. She unwrapped the oilcloth with hands that had gone steady, now dead steady the way they always went when the work was real. And there in the firelight of his own last cabin, Amos Calder spoke to his family across the silence of one long winter. A letter in the strong, square hand from the deed, and folded inside it the true debt paper, the real one. A small, honest sum, near paid off with a true seal pressed at its foot, and Addie did not even have to count the feathers she could see from a yard away that there were 7. And the letter said in an old man's plain words that Horace Thorne had come to him with an offer for the water and been refused, and come again and been refused, and that after the second refusal, the small old debt against the ranch had quietly and possibly swollen into a monstrous one, and that Amos had gone to the land office and found a paper there bearing his family's name, and a figure he had never agreed to, and a seal he did not trust, and that he was afraid, and that he was setting the true paper down here with this letter so that if anything should happen to an old man on a road he had ridden 10,000 times, his sons would know. It had not been the river. It had not been the river, Emmett said. His voice was barely there. He was looking at his father's handwriting the way a man looks at a face. He knew. He knew it was coming for him, and he wrote it down and he hid it in the one place he trusted, and then he went out and he protected you, Addie said gently, even afraid, even at the end. He left you the thing that would save the ranch. You were never going to lose it, Emmett. He would not let you. He just could not be here to hand it to you himself. The storm howled. The child slept. And 3 grown mountain men sat in their dead father's cabin and wept without shame. And Addie Calder, who was not yet a Calder by law, but was already one by every measure that counted, held the true paper to the firelight and let them grieve, because grief, she knew better than anyone alive, is only love that has been told to stand outside in the cold. But she also knew this. She knew it with the clear, hard part of her mind that never fully slept. A letter from a dead man was a grief. It was not yet a verdict. Amos Calder's word against Horace Thorne's forged seal would need a court. And a court meant the circuit judge, and the circuit judge would not come up this mountain to a cabin. The Calders would have to carry their truth down into Cedar Gap, into the bowl of the valley, into the town where the land clerk did Thorne's bidding and the sheriff drew Thorne's pay. And Horace Thorne already knew that a careful woman had been counting feathers. The storm broke after 3 days. The Calders did not waste the days it gave them. They came down off the mountain the moment the passes would bear a horse, and they did the patient, unglamorous work that wins a thing in a courtroom, which is not a brave speech, but a careful one. Addie copied the 2 debt papers out in her own clean clerk's hand twice, so that if a fire took one set, a second set would live. She wrote down word for word the night Pruitt's hands had gone still on the counter, and the date of it and the hour. She made Emmett ride to 3 different ranches down the valley and asked plainly who else carried paper held by Horace Thorne. And the answers came back, and she wrote those down too, a column of frightened neighbors, and the column was its own kind of evidence. And on the second day, Emmett rode north alone to a small parcel of land above the Calder line and came back at dark with a man beside him. The man was Shoshone. He sat a horse the way Emmett sat one, as if the horse were a continuation of his own thought, and he was perhaps 60 years old, and the Calders called him Walks Far, and Emmett spoke to him the way a man speaks to someone he has known and trusted his whole life. He broke horses alongside my father for 20 years. Emmett told Addie quietly in the yard, while the man saw to his own animal. Before there was a Calder ranch, there was the 2 of them in a string of green horses and a handshake. My father trusted his judgment over any white man's in this valley and said so, and it cost him friendships, and he did not care. He paused. Bertie calls him uncle. I want you to understand what he is to this family before you understand what he is to this case. That night at the long table, Walks Far told them what he had carried alone for a season and more. He had been on the high trail above the ford the autumn morning Amos died. He had seen 2 riders at the crossing, riders he knew belonged to Horace Thorne, and he had seen them at work at the cinch of a horse, and the horse had not been theirs. He had gone after to the sheriff. He had gone to 2 other men of standing in Cedar Gap, and each of them in his own words and his own tone had told him the same thing, which was that the word of such a man did not weigh anything, and that he should be careful of strangers saying such things about a man like Thorne. I did not stop saying it because I was afraid, Walks Far said. He said it without heat, the way Hollis said weather. I stopped saying it because there was no one left who would let the words land. A thing you say into a room that has decided not to hear you is not testimony. It is only noise. I have waited. He looked at Addie and then at Emmett. I waited to see if this valley would ever build a room that would hear it. It will, Addie said. In 9 days, I will build you the room. And the reckoning came faster than the thaw, because Horace Thorne did not wait 9 days to come up the mountain. It came up the road in the shape of three riders, and Horace Thorne was the middle one. And Addie, watching from the porch, understood at last what patience looked like coming on. He was not a large man. She had expected a large man. He was neat and gray and unhurried, and he climbed the porch steps the way a man climbs the steps of a building he has already bought. He had the sheriff with him, another of the men Thorne's money had quietly bought, a heavy badge and a heavier silence, and he had papers. "I will be brief," Thorne said, "because the road down is long and I dislike this cold." He did not look at Emmett or at Hollis or at the rope burns still raw on their hands. He looked at Addie. He looked only at Addie, and his eyes were mild, and that mildness was the most frightening thing she had ever stood in front of. "Mrs. Calder, or no, not yet, Miss Crane, forgive me. I make it my business to be accurate about papers, and the paper says you are not married at all." "Say what you came to see," Hollis said. "I came to be neighborly." Thorne unfolded the first document. "The debt against this ranch falls due. I have been patient past all reason out of respect for your late father, but a man cannot be patient forever. The sum is beyond your means. We all of us at this railing know it is beyond your means. So the land comes to me, and the water with it, and that is simply arithmetic, and I have never yet met the family that could argue with arithmetic." He unfolded the second document. "And there is the child, damn." For the first time, something moved under the mildness, and it was worse than anger. It was satisfaction. A motherless girl, a house full of unmarried men, a bride who it turns out is bound by a marriage contract to one brother while keeping company with another. I am sure the territory's view of a fit home for a young child would be most understanding. Or it would not. These things can go either way, and they go the way a man of standing suggests they go. He let that sit. He let it sit on the cold porch like something dead. "I am not a hard man. Sign the land to me, all of you today, and I will see that no question is ever raised about the child. Refuse me, and I will raise every question there is." And there it was. The whole snare sprung at last in daylight. Addie felt the ground tilt, because he had reached past the ranch, past the water, past the murder even, and he had put his neat gray hand on the one thing in that house that had no defense at all. He had put his hand on Bertie. She heard Emmett's breath go ragged. She heard behind her the door and a small body, because Bertie had come to the door. Bertie had heard the word child, and the child stood in the doorway, clutching her wooden horse and looking up at the gray man who was discussing whether she might be taken away from everyone she had left in the world. And something in Addie Crane that had been bowed for 9 long years stood all the way up. "You forged a territorial seal," she said. The mildness on Thorne's face did not change, but it became very slightly a held thing, a performance now instead of a fact. "I beg your pardon. You heard me precisely, Mr. Thorne. You have made it your business to be accurate." Addie came down off the porch step. She did not raise her voice. She had learned in a recorder's office that the quietest voice in a room is the one men lean in to hear. The debt paper filed against this family carries a recorder's seal with 6 feathers in the eagle's wing. The territorial seal carries 7. It has carried 7 since before you ever rode into this valley. I copied that seal for 2 years of my life, sir, until the shape of the true one lived in my own hand, and I will say so to a circuit judge under oath, and I will say it clearly, and I will say it in a voice that carries. The sheriff shifted his weight. The porch board spoke under him. "A woman's fancy," Thorne said, "about feathers." "Then you will not mind the judge looking," Addie said. "An innocent seal fears no counting." And Thorne's mild eyes just for an instant went to the sheriff. And it was the smallest thing. It was a flick, a flinch, a man checking that his ground was still under him. But Addie saw it, and Emmett saw it, and the look told the whole valley everything it needed to know. "There is no judge," Thorne said, and the mildness was thinning. Now you could hear the iron coming up under it. Who will take the word of an unmarried clerk over the filed papers of a man of standing? You have no proof. You have a wrong feather and a grievance. "No," Addie said. I have your true debt paper, the real one, the small, honest one your forgery was built to bury. She watched that land in him. She watched it land like a blow he had not seen coming because he had not all his patient scheming had never once accounted for a hearthstone in a poor cabin. And I have a letter in Amos Calder's own hand, written in the weeks before he died, naming you, naming your offers for the water, and naming his own fear of exactly the road he was found dead upon. A dead man's testimony Mr. Thorne, in his own writing, set down before he ever rode to that crossing. You did not only forge a debt, and I think a judge will be very interested in the difference between a debt and a grave. The wind moved across the meadow. Nobody on that porch breathed. Horace Thorne looked at Addie Crane for a long, long moment, and she watched him do the arithmetic he had told her no family could argue with, and she watched the arithmetic come out for the first time in his patient life against him. You are bluffing, he said, but it was a question now. He had not meant it to be a question. Cedar Gap, Addie said, has a circuit court in 9 days. We will all of us be there. You may bring your 6 feathers, sir. We will bring our 7. The 9 days that followed were the longest of Addie's life, and she filled every hour of them, because a woman who fills her hours has no room left over to be afraid in them. She drilled the order of the papers until she could lay them down in the dark. She walked walks far through what the room would be like, the noise of it, the faces, so that nothing in that courtroom could surprise a man who had already been made to wait at too many doors. And on the last evening, with the lamp burning down, Emmett came and sat across from her at the long table and put his rough hand flat over both of hers. Whatever the judge says, he said, I want one thing said first, where the saying of it does not depend on him. You came here as a thing my brother advertised for. You will walk into that courtroom as the woman holding this family's whole life in her 2 hands. I do not know how to thank a person for that. I have looked. There is no word the right size. Then do not look for one, Addie said. Just stand where I can see you. The court at Cedar Gap was held in the long room above the Mercantile, and on the day that room could not hold the valley. They came down off every ranch and out of every claim. They lined the walls, and they filled the stairs, and they stood out in the muddy street under the windows, because word of a thing like this runs through a mountain valley like water finding the low ground. And the word was that the Calder bride was going to stand up in front of God and the territory and call Horace Thorne a murderer. Judge Alcott was a spare-old man with spectacles and a face that had been disappointed by a great many people and had stopped being surprised by it. He was not Thorne's. That was the first mercy. The circuit rode in from outside the valley, outside the reach of Thorne's patient money, and Judge Alcott owed the man nothing but the same justice he owed a stray dog. Thorne's lawyer spoke first, and he spoke well, and he laid the filed debt before the court with its seal and its figure and its weight of law, and he spoke of grief and of a desperate family and of a clever newcomer woman with a head full of fancies, and Addie sat with her hands folded in her lap and let him. She had nursed a dying man for 9 years. She knew how to wait out a thing that was only sound. Then Judge Alcott looked over his spectacles and said, the court will hear the woman. And Adeline Crane stood up. She did not tremble. She had thought she might. She had lain awake the night before, certain that her voice would shake the way it had shaken in the street the day she met a ghost. But it did not shake because this was not her grief she was carrying up to the front of that room. It was Amos Calder's. And you can carry another person's grief much further and much steadier than you can ever carry your own. She did not give a speech. She had no gift for speeches, and she did not reach for one. She did what she had been built by 2 quiet, unregarded years in a recorder's office to do. She laid the 2 papers side by side on the judge's table. This is the debt filed against the Calder Ranch, she said. And this is the debt Amos Calder hid beneath his own hearthstone with a letter in the last weeks of his life. The court will see they name the same family and the same land. The court will see they do not name the same sum, And the court will see if the court will do me the kindness of counting that the seal on the filed paper has 6 feathers in the eagle's wing, and the seal on Amos Calder's true paper has 7, and that the territorial seal as the clerk of this very county can confirm under oath. And as I believe he very much does not wish to, has carried 7 feathers since the year this territory was surveyed. The room made a sound, a low sound, a long sound, the sound of 200 people leaning toward the same table at once. Judge Alcott bent his spare gray head. He took out a second pair of spectacles and set them over the first. And the old circuit judge, who owed Horace Thorne nothing, counted the feathers on the seal himself, in a silence so complete that Addie could hear the spring wind in the street. He counted them twice. Then he looked up, and he did not look at Addie, and he did not look at the lawyer. He looked at Horace Thorne, and his disappointed old face had found, after all its years, one more thing in a man it could be disappointed by. Thorne's lawyer rose to call it a coincidence, of the engraver's tool, a flaw in a stamp, a thing that proved nothing. And Addie, still on her feet, answered him before the judge had to. A flawed stamp, she said, marks every paper it touches. The territory has filed 10,000 papers with a true seal, and not one of them is short a feather. But this stamp has marked exactly one document in the history of this county, and that document is the one that would have handed a dead man's water to the man at that table. A tool used once is not a worn tool, sir. It is a tool made for a single job. What came after came quickly, the way a dam goes quickly once the first true crack has run. The clerk Pruitt was called, and Pruitt, faced with a perjurer's prison on the one hand and a forger's on the other, chose a smaller grave. In his thin, shaking voice, named the night Thorne's papers had come across his counter to be filed without a proper seal. Amos Calder's letter was read aloud into the room, every plain and frightened word of it. An honest man's voice come down off the mountain from beyond his own grave to name the man who had hunted him. And then the Calder's witness was called, and a Shoshone horseman named Walks Far, who had broken horses alongside Amos Calder for 20 years and who had been made to wait, Addie noted, longer outside that courtroom than any other witness, came and stood before Judge Alcott. He said simply and without anger that he had been on the high trail above the ford. Autumn morning, Amos died and had seen 2 of Thorne's riders at the crossing before the old man ever reached it, and had seen them at the cinch of a horse that was not theirs. He said he had carried it to the sheriff and to 2 other men of standing, and had been told each time that the word of such a man did not count. "It counts here," said Judge Alcott. "It counts in this room." Let the record show the court found it worth more than most of what it heard today, and let the record show the court is ashamed of every door this man was turned from before he reached this one. And Addie watched Walks Far receive that the straightening of his shoulders, and she thought that. That is the whole of it. A man's word weighed for its truth and not for his blood. If this valley learns one thing from this day, let it be that, and let it outlast the rest. Horace Thorne did not go mild to the end. At the end, the mildness fell off him entirely, and what was underneath was only a small gray man who had believed his whole patient life that everything could be bought because everyone had a price, and who had finally, on a spring morning above a mercantile, met a thing with no price at all: a dead man's love for his sons, a clerk's 2 unregarded years, a child's wooden horse, a horseman who had waited a whole season for one honest room, a woman the world had called past her use, who had turned out to be the one set of eyes in the territory that could count to 7. He was bound over for the murder of Amos Calder. The forged debt was struck down and burned in the stove of that same courtroom, and the true debt, the small honest one, the Calders paid in full before the month was out. The senior right to the water came home to the family that had held it for 40 years. And the question of a motherless child in an unfit home was never raised by anyone ever again, because the man who had meant to raise it was going to spend the rest of his days in a territorial prison, and because 4 weeks later, the home in question stopped being a thing anyone could call unfit. They were married in the meadow in the high gold light of a mountain summer on the grass above the river that had been made by then only a river again. Hollis gave the bride away and did it with his hat in his hand and his hard face working, and not one soul present said a word about the working of it. Asa made a speech. It was an unbearable speech. It went on far past its natural life and lost its own thread more than once, and Asa wept all the way through it openly, the way he had wept at the Bean funeral. And it was every clumsy, overlong word of it, the truest thing anyone said all day. Walks Far stood with the family in the family's place where the family had asked him to stand. And Bertie carried the flowers. She carried them in a basket with enormous gravity, scattering them by the fistful in a way that had nothing to do with the path. And halfway down she stopped, and she turned around, and in front of the whole valley she ran back and took Addie's hand and looked up the long way into her face and said the words she had been carrying unspoken in her chest, the way she carried the wooden horse, the way you carry a thing until you are ready. Mama. Just that. And then she went back to her flowers as if she had not just stopped 100 hearts in a mountain meadow. Addie Crane married Emmett Calder under a sky so wide and so blue, it did not seem possible it had ever held a storm. And when the small kiss came gentle and brief and watched over by 3 brothers and a child and a horseman, and a whole valley of witnesses, it was not the kiss of 2 young people gambling on a future they could not see. It was the kiss of 2 people who had each been told the road was closed, who had each separately in the dark made their grim peace with a smaller life, and who had found out against all the arithmetic that the road had been open the whole time and had only been waiting for them to be brave enough and old enough and finally unafraid enough to walk back down it toward each other. The summer turned the way summers do, and the spring after there was a morning when Addie stood on the long porch of the Calder house with a coffee cup warming her hands and watched the light come up the valley and felt the whole place breathing around her awake and safe in hers. The ranch had prospered. Hollis still rose before all of them and worked past all of them, but Addie had taught him his letters through the long, snowbound evenings, patiently, one piece at a time, the way you build a fire. It had been slow going at the start, and Hollis had been a hard student, not because his mind was slow, but because his pride was a heavy thing to get past. And there had been an evening early on when he had set the primer down and said he was too old, and Addie should not waste good lamp oil on him. And Addie had said that her own father had been 3 times Hollis's age when she taught him to sign his name with a steady hand, which was a small lie in the service of a large truth, and Hollis had picked the primer back up. And there were nights now when she came into the warm room and found that hard winter man bent over a book with his finger under the words, his lips moving, and she had learned to walk softly past and let him be. Because some things a person should be allowed to come to alone. Asa was courting a school teacher down in Cedar Gap and was unbearable about it. And they were all of them grateful for that because an unbearable Asa was a happy one. Bertie had grown taller and no less fierce and had appointed herself that spring the herald of a new and incoming Calder, and informed the unborn child loudly and daily of everything it would need to know, because there was an incoming Calder. Addie stood on the porch in the morning light, with one hand resting quiet against the small new curve of herself, and she thought of all of it, the sold dishes, and the empty house, and the long coach, and the muddy street, and the man who had turned around. The grave that had been empty all along. And on the broad porch rail in front of her, warming in the first of the sun, stood 2 small carved wooden horses side by side. The old one from a Kansas summer, 11 years and a whole lifetime gone. And beside it a new one just finished the wood still pale, carved by the same patient hands on the long evenings while he sat beside her and the fire burned down low and good. 2 horses, 1 herd. The mountain stood up all around the little house, vast and bright and indifferent, exactly as they had always stood. But the life inside the house was not indifferent. The life inside of this house was full, and it was warm, and it had been fought for, and it had been every long mile and every hard winter of it worth the fighting. And Addie Calder, who had once believed her whole story was already told, drank her coffee in the rising light and felt the new one move under her hand and was not afraid of anything the valley could bring. Now and then a person will tell you that the best of life belongs to the young, that love has a season and the season is brief, and when it has passed, a body ought to be sensible and fold its hands and be content with what is left. Do not believe it. Adeline Crane gave 9 years to a dying man's bedside and asked for nothing back. And the world looked at what was left of her and called it too little and too late. And the world was wrong. The world is so often wrong about women, it has decided to stop watching. Her best years were not behind her on that muddy morning in Cedar Gap. Her best years had not been born yet. They were still up the mountain, waiting in a house full of books and horses, and all she had to do in the end was be brave enough to climb. It is never too late to be loved. It is never too late to be known. And it is never not ever too late to walk back down the road toward the thing you thought you had buried and find it standing in the sunlight alive and turning to look at you and saying your name like it had been holding it under its tongue for years.